and warm welcome on a Monday night. As usual, now we have our time at 7. And so, welcome to Jesus, the best life ever lived. And we are asking questions about life. And every week we're tackling a different kind of scenario. And tonight we have a special guest, and I'm so excited about tonight's talk. We have Hennie, good friend of us from Victoria West. He's been in politics years ago as a minister particularly when it comes to economy and about our country and the well-being of our country. But at the moment, he's working for Century, which is he can actually explain it better, but the best way I can explain it is a data management company that helps governments to particularly in the banking arena, to understand and prefer their banking systems, and particularly their engagement with the people of that country. So at the moment he's working for Century in Uganda. Sorry, not Uganda, Rwanda. So very, very warm welcome. We're going to bring him into screen in a few moments. But before I do that, I want us to pray and to dedicate this evening to you guys. That are with us tonight. This is always a technology breakthrough, that we have a class like this and we have Hennie speaking to you all the way from Victoria West. And then also this is live, so people are listening live, and even a few weeks later, for those who missed it, can actually join in. Let's just thank God for technology. I think that helps a little bit. So let's just pray. Father God, we just thank you that you are never caught out. You are never caught off guard. You are still in control. And so, Father, in this evening, I pray that you will lead and guide us. And thank you for this privilege to listen to Hennie and his wisdom and his understanding as you have ventured with him in a pathway of holiness and dedication and finding the true path, the path of the kingdom. And so, Father, I pray tonight that you will lead us in the truth, particularly when we talk about the economy and the future of the economy. Where should we position ourselves? How should we think about what is happening at the moment in the global economy? And we ask you, Father, for your wisdom, as you are the great wisdom, the great understanding of truth. And so, Father, we pray that truth will lead and guide us in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, I've asked Hennie because he's particularly when it comes to financial systems and so forth, that's the work he also does in Rwanda. But he has become a friend to us in many ways, speaking and thinking deeply about church and how we should position ourselves, particularly in the economy. And tonight I've asked him and I said, how should we know that the things of the kingdom is eternal, but we live in a physical world that's not eternal, it's very temporary. And so how do we guide ourselves and how do we lead ourselves in this time? So, Hennie, so much welcome, and you can say hello. And we also, I'm going to get off screen so that you can have the privilege of having our screen tonight all the way from Victoria West. And it's so great to have you with us tonight. Hennie.
Yeah. Good evening, Jan. Good evening, all the friends in Clanwilliam. I can't see you, but I can see you in my mind's eye. It's a particular pleasure to be with you this evening. This is a wonderful topic. We have a Harvester Church here in Victoria West with Pastor Lazarus Makwena, and I'm a part of that. So we're part of the larger family, and I think this is a really big topic. I think it's a highly relevant topic, and it's a privilege to be with you. So, Jan, I mean, back to you, or should I just kick off? I think I can continue. Um,
Just jumped
all
away
right.
from the screen, Hennie, so I'm just quickly jumping to the microphone. You can continue.
Oh, fantastic. All right. So Jan asked me to share some thoughts with you on how God's economy works. And it's obviously a big topic, as we will see. And I think one thing that has really struck me is that the challenges that we have, certainly in our country, to move towards an economy that works according to God's principles, are challenges which lie not only in the political realm. I think, as you will see, they are much, much bigger, and only God, through His power, can really make this happen. So I will touch on a few things this evening. I think the first one is just briefly to recap what we understand under the term economy, and then just to touch on some biblical concepts that I think are relevant to this topic, and then just go through 7 building blocks of God's economy. And Jan, I mean, obviously, people are welcome to interrupt me. Otherwise, I'll make sure to just stop soon enough so that there's enough time for questions. So I think, the Oxford English Dictionary is always a good source of definitions, and they define the economy as the state of a country or region in terms, or for that matter, a city, in terms of the production and consumption of goods and services and the supply of money. So just lifting out 3 concepts that are core to this definition is obviously production. So we're thinking of things like entrepreneurship, we think of work, we think of resources, labor, capital, land for farming, we think of creativity, we think of craftsmanship. When we think of things like consumption, we think of need, we think of wealth, of poverty, of stewardship, of greed, of well-being, of peace. And when we think of money, we're thinking of value, we're thinking of buying and selling, of investment, of interest, and obviously of mammon, because there's always a spiritual dimension as well. And I think what you will see from this, and that's really the intention here, is that the Bible has much to say about these concepts, and that if we come to the economy, we can come with full confidence that God has some very important things to say about the economy. So I think firstly, in terms of the foundational concepts, I think there's 4 that I want to deal with here. And in many cases, I've just quoted here the relevant text because, God is powerful and He speaks by His Spirit through His word. So sometimes the word is just good enough and strong enough, and in fact, it always is, to speak on its own. So the first of the foundational concepts that I just wanted to raise here is truth. We worship in spirit and in truth. And this particular quote from Psalm 100 is a favorite of mine. For the Lord is good, His mercy is everlasting, and His truth endures to all generations. And we find so much being spoken about the truth in the Bible. And I'm putting it here because, to me, if the concepts that we will touch on here, and also that appears elsewhere in the word, are true, then the concepts upon which God's economy are built do not change with changes in economic theory, or with changes in technology, or even with the rise and fall of economic systems. So we've seen, certainly in the past century, the rise and fall of socialism, of communism, and there are many other different systems that have come. And the truth is that they've gone. But God's principles have really stuck. And it's like gravity, you ignore it at your peril. And I think what we've seen in the world is that economies that do not recognize God's principles will ultimately fail, or will just be reformed, because His principles indeed are the truth. So it's worth seeking them, because in the time of what seems to be disruption at the moment, and one of the things I've learned in politics is that when you hear news, it's never as good or as bad as it seems at the first moment. And you've got to give time. Got to take time to see how it pans out. So even now, since President Trump has come in, it's been almost 4 months, and there's been huge disruption. But the truth has not changed. The second thing is time. I mean, the one leads to the next. And I want to quote this text from Ephesians. This is Paul speaking, obviously, Ephesians, that great book about the church. And he says that he, that is God, might present her to himself, a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. This is really Paul speaking about Jesus and the church in the context of husband and wife here. But the point to me is that the end game for God's people is not a corrupt economic wasteland. And certainly in the past 40, 50 years, we have seen a type of apocalyptic thinking coming out of the church. Very often it has come in the form of particularly many television preachers who come with very alarmist approaches that the end of the world is near. And the result has been this type of thinking has led to a perverted set of economic actions, often amongst God's people, which is the opposite of stewardship. Because the point is, if you have a short-term view, then if the world is going to end tomorrow, then you shouldn't sow, you shouldn't plant, you shouldn't build, because quite frankly, why are you doing that? You should consume. And this has led very often to fraudulent and corrupt activities, whereas that is not God's perspective. It's not Christ's perspective. His perspective is the perspective of eternity. And that always requires long-term thinking, in fact, very long-term thinking. So a true view, I think, of the Bible and of God's people in the world is that they build, is that they contribute to the economy, that they work as if the world is going to be around for a very long time. But corruption is the result of the opposite type of thinking. So time, as we've often seen financial services, if your perspective is tonight, which is very often what we find amongst the poor, they have a very high discount rate. So it's not possible for them to see value in the long run. And then you never build, you never save, you don't educate your children because they're not going to be around tomorrow. But as believers in Christ and in his purposes, we have a long-term view. And you will see that these concepts are concepts that underlie how we go about our economic activities. The third one is really the concept of liberty, the concept of freedom. And I've got three texts here that I think goes to the essence of it. The first one is the Jubilee texts out of Leviticus 25, and you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his possession, and each of you shall return to his family. You shall see possessions and family is a fundamental link in the economy. In fact, in God's economy, you cannot separate the two. And of course, in this text as well is Isaiah refers to it in Isaiah 61 when he speaks about the year of liberty. The second one is the famous one in Proverbs, and the borrower is servant to the lender. It's the slavery of debt, which is the opposite of what God intends for an economy. And then the last one is Jesus answered them, most assuredly I say to you, whoever commits sin is a slave to sin, and a slave does not abide in the house forever, but a son abides forever. Therefore, if the Son makes you free, you shall be free indeed. And we tend to think about this in the context of sin and of Jesus atoning for that. But I suggest that there's a deeper truth here, and that is that slaves cannot build, because ultimately the environment in which they find themselves, they are not the ultimate recipients of what is being built. They work for wages only. And I think South Africa, amongst others, still is deeply in bondage to the spirit of slavery. And people who are in bondage to that actually cannot build. And the spirit of the orphan also runs very closely to this. So the slave is ultimately a consumer, not a builder. And the more slaves you have in a nation, the less economic growth you will have and the less prosperity you will have. So I think freedom, liberty is to eat the fruit of your own labor. And you will see that is a very strong theme in the prophets. And even in the time of the judges, you would often have seen that that Israel, when they drifted away from God, they were not allowed to eat the fruit of their labor. That's, for example, where we found Gideon trampling his grapes and working in hiding because of the Philistines and others. I think the second thing is that the freedom to choose is fundamental to any strong economy. It is the ability to choose that allows you to make your own investments, to allocate your labor to places that you are passionate about, to be an entrepreneur. So this freedom is deeply ingrained in God's economy. And of course, it's the opposite of debt. The slavery of debt is in fact the absence of liberty to allocate resources as you see fit. And then finally, this point I made: the slave doesn't have the incentive to build. And that is why private property is so fundamental to God's economy. So this liberty component is a huge thing. And that's, of course, one of the reasons why, and we can come back to this concept of apartheid. I've got some different takes on it, but it was denying people the liberty of choice to make economic choices. And that really kept South Africa back. And then finally, the fourth concept is it's a concept of what I would call fellowship, or koinonia, that word you find in Acts 2. But it's really the essence of the Christian economy. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And it is loving this concept of wanting the best for your neighbor. In Acts 2, once the Spirit has been poured out, we have this very well-known text, and they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and in fellowship, in the breaking of bread and in prayers, and they shared so much of what they had. And then, of course, in 1 Timothy, but if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And and the point of God's economy is, the Babylonian economy, the economy of the world, is one of buying and selling. Um, but the essence of God's economy is of giving and receiving. And it's interesting. A very good friend of mine made a comment a few years ago, which I really hold to be biblical and true. And he said the objective of the market economy is to atomize society, to break society down into the smallest possible unit to which you can sell. And I mean, the most extreme version of this ultimately is financial old age provision, because you sell that to the individual so that that individual can buy a retirement which they can spend in loneliness. And God's economy is the opposite. God's economy is I give, because my needs are not only physical, that they're also mental, they're also spiritual. And as we give and receive, this core element becomes really, really important. So everything in the Bible is about the quality and strength of our relationships with God and our neighbor. You shall, first commandment, love your God as yourself. The second commandment, love God, love your neighbor as yourself, the second commandment. So God's economy is in essence a relational economy. And our wealth and our security lie in our relationships and not in our bank accounts. And our provision is from God and through one another. And it's interesting. You will not read a single word in the Bible about pensions or about welfare payments from the state. It is a foreign concept in God's economy. The family must provide for its own, and the community or the church must provide for its weak. So we've all watched with interest the VAT debacle and the whole budget debacle, and our Minister of Finance who had to withdraw his budget. But if you look at that budget, two of the three largest items in South Africa's budget, so the largest one is in fact education. The second largest one is, no, I'm not sure which one is 2 and 3, but the second and the third ones are respectively welfare payments, SASSA payments, and interest on debt. And none of those two functions should be in the expenditure items of the budget at all, because debt should not be there as a nation, and neither should welfare payments. And it's in fact those two items put together that currently is the single largest block on economic growth and the ability of lifting all our people out of poverty. So a fundamental concept. Let's then move to the building blocks of God's economy. The first one is the family. The 10 Commandments tell us, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land. Proverbs 13:22 really captures this three-generational family very, very well. A good man leaves an inheritance, that's a spelling mistake there, to his children's children, in other words, to his grandchildren, but the wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous. So, in other words, my perspective as a father and as a grandfather should be to leave that inheritance for my grandchildren. Um, and in the biblical economy, this three generational family is the fundamental unit of society. And it was within the extended family that a person's primary needs for provision and belonging were met. These units were economically self supporting, and they also acted as a safety net for those who did not have families of their own. Psalm 68, for example, speaks um, about God placing the orphans in families. So it doesn't say God created a sasa payment for orphans. No, no, no. It says the the families, the body provides for those. And the truth is that ultimately wealth is built and transferred through the family, the very concept of an inheritance. And it's fascinating to me to go on that over the past century, South Africa has seen two major economic empowerment initiatives aimed at distinct population segments. We had Afrikaner economic empowerment from 1924, which was when the Hertzog government came in, roughly to about 1960. 1961, you can still push it there. And then you had Black economic empowerment from 1994, roughly to this time. And the point is that if you look back at history, the former Afrikaner economic empowerment was really largely spectacularly successful. And the latter has been largely unsuccessful. And the question is why? And I would suggest to you is that the Afrikaner community had intact families, but the Black community did not have intact families. And if you look at the past 150 years in South Africa, I have a somewhat iconoclastic view. And my view is that the tragedy of South Africa in the 20th century was not apartheid, but the systematic undermining and destruction of the Black family. And I mean, it goes back to, if you look at economic history, to the 1880s when Cecil Rhodes imposed monetary taxes on the Black communities, particularly in the Eastern Cape, to force the men to leave their homes. And you had a very flourishing economic communities in the Eastern Cape at that time to earn cash, and they had to go to the mines. And mixed hostels were not allowed in the mines. So you had this whole migrant labor system, and the men started new families on the Rand, and the family structure started to fracture. And then from 1948, you had Group Areas Act, which separated people even more from their families. And when that played out over about 30 years, and then we had AIDS, which destroyed that 20, 30-year-olds, which were the heart of the family structure. And now, even since 94, and particularly now, you have the welfare system, which very often put the entitlement to the funding in the hands of the unwedded mother rather than in a family structure. So by and large, economic communities, Black communities, will not be economically empowered until their families are restored. And that goes for every population group everywhere in the world. So the unit of the family is really the most fundamental unit to build an economy. The second building block is private property. And I've quoted the verse from Leviticus earlier, but the vision really is that each extended family, the biblical one in the Mosaic laws, had its own land, and that was allocated when they went into the promised land, and that enabled each family to remain economically self-sufficient, and that was also one of the ways which God provided to prevent this massive inequality in society. So you will find that any economic system built on communal property or ownership by the state is doomed to fail, and we've seen that with the communist system. And even communal ownership governed by traditional leaders in South Africa has not enabled wealth creation for millions of our people. And when this massive inequalities build up in our economic system, we very often have economic crashes that destroys a lot of this accumulated value so that you can get more equality. But the essence of this dynamo is private property. So if you really want to empower a nation, allow them to trade with the land on which they live or to have private property. The third concept is really entrepreneurship. And I mean, we all know the parable of the talents, and where Jesus really speak about the reward and the rightness and the due reward for people who go out and trade, who invest, who work hard. And it's interesting that that concept actually, God has this very interesting concept, the seed principle in Genesis 8, verse 22, is after the flood. You know the story. Noah offers and God responds, and he says, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest shall not cease. And it's this point, you've got to sow so that you can generate a harvest. And Jesus speaks about this tenfold, 20-fold in the parable of the sower as well. So in God's economy, there's multiplication, and it comes from sowing and reaping. And we can only create new value by venturing. And you know, if there's no new value, the state cannot tax. So the very essence of our ability to give comes from venturing. And he who ventures more, receives more value. So the entrepreneur is a very important part of God's economy. The fourth building block is obviously work. You know, Paul speaks about it. You know, he doesn't work, shall not eat. And, you know, we labor with our hands so that we have something to grieve. And, you know, it's always interesting. Jesus speaks about it. It says, sell what you have and give alms, and provide yourselves money bags which do not grow old, a treasure in heaven. So there's this concept that if you don't have money from your labor, your spiritual growth itself is stifled. So, you know, by working, we create value, which allows us to live and to give. And if we do not work, that's those spiritual treasures. It's ultimately the only thing you can truly earn is what you give away in many ways. I remember that wonderful story of the founder of the Rothschild dynasty, who you know, had dinner with Queen Victoria, and you know, she told him, you know, now, Mr. Rothschild, you're obviously a very rich man. Tell me how much money you have. And he took out his pocketbook, and he made a calculation, and you know, he gave her an amount which was a lot smaller than his fortune. And the queen asked him, but surely you know, you've got lots more money than that. And his response was, I only have what I've given away. And I thought that's such a powerful concept of why we work. But I think recently I've also discovered another concept, and that is that work, and especially craftsmanship and creativity, is an antidote to oppression and corruption. And I've recently read quite a bit in Zechariah. And that's obviously about God through His Spirit encouraging people to build the temple. But there's this wonderful in that first, second vision. He has the four horns and then the four craftsmen that are coming to terrify the horns, which are the empires of the nation, to cast out the horns of the nations that lifted up their horn against the land of Judah to scattering. And there's this point about our creativity, our innovation by itself being an antidote to corruption and oppression and political dominance. And I think it's so true in South Africa. There's lots of people that complain, but the antidote, the God's way of dealing with what we so often see in our country is obviously justice. But I want to highlight this thing of craftsmanship, of creativity. Then quickly, just something about money. I think that's a whole topic in itself, but I just want to highlight one or two things. The unjust steward was commended by Jesus because he dealt shrewdly. And then, obviously the Deuteronomy point about interest, that you should not charge interest to your brother, that the Lord your God may bless you in all to which you set your hand. And the point here is really that in the biblical model, money was intended to build or serve relationships. And the laws around debt and interest prevented financial capital from being multiplied by the rich at the expense of the poor, which would have increased, again, this thing of inequality in society, which God does not like. And debt was really just a last resort, a solution to a desperate need. It wasn't intended as, when credit cards really started, it was started by retailers to increase consumption in the United States. It was never intended to finance consumption. And even, very interesting, our investments should be relational. In other words, it's not really intended to be a far off unit trust investment. It's an investment close to home where I can help, where I can mentor the recipient to grow a business or to become wise in how they farm. So this money is intended. The power of mammon is broken by a relational use of money. Second last one, rest. Rest is a fundamental part of God's economy. The Sabbath was made for man, Jesus said, and not man for Sabbath. Because our life and our economic success is dependent on two relationships, with God and with people. And because it's so much easier to focus on people, they're around us, there's a special day to really just focus on God, and to trust in His provision and to preserve our resources. And, since I myself has really been very diligent about the Sabbath, I have found that my creativity has really increased. And then finally, Jan, and I'm trying to stick to your time, there's the concept of stewardship. Again, this thing of time. This is David praying when he's taken the offering from the people for the temple. And there's this wonderful phrase. He says, "For all things come from you, and of your own we have given you." We are strangers and pilgrims through the earth, and we can ultimately own nothing physically. We can only own truly spiritual things. And therefore, we should live with eternity in mind and preserve that which is given into our care. We should be good stewards of the land, of the nature that's entrusted to us, of the relations that are ours, of the institutions and the businesses that are ours, because we build them so that other people can live. And, so God's economy ultimately, we delight, as Solomon says, in which we can eat and drink, and we build homes, but ultimately other people will live in them. And we want all people to prosper through God's economy. Yeah, and I can carry on, but let me stop there. I think that, yeah, that's the end of it. Thanks.
Hennie, you can still continue.
No, no, I'm finished. I'd rather have an opportunity um, to to respond to questions if there are any questions and discussions. Yeah, I'm just checking that you're there.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
There
Thanks.
you go. Thank you very much, Hennie. I think this has this been incredible so far. I want to ask you a question, Hennie. I think there's one of the issues that came out tonight that I think is so very important is the call it the holiness or the sanctity of work. That work and contributing and this whole idea of retirement and that somewhere you go sit in an old age home and you just of no value anymore. Would you mind speaking a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, um, let me first deal with the issue of work. I think work has multiple functions. So in um, in God's economy, we work in multiple ways. I think the first way in which we work is for our own risk, where we actually don't receive a return as a wage. We receive a return in our sort of entrepreneurship dividend, if we call it that way. So that's the first part of work, and um, I think God has a very strong intention for as many people as possible to work for your own account. And it's very interesting if you look at the theory of economic growth. There are essentially two types of capital formation. So capital formation is when you're a farmer and you cultivate a piece of new land, and you're going to put you plant citrus trees in it, or if you plant a crop, and you put capital into it, or you build a factory, for example, or you build a road. And it's interesting if you look at economic theory and practice, the return on investment where somebody builds capital for their own risks is much higher to a country than when a government does capital formation, because the incentives are so much bigger when people do there for their own risks. So if a country stifles entrepreneurship, it basically stifles the ability to generate value that can lift people out of poverty, can can benefit them. So that return and the work that you put into that is really important. On the other side, if you labor, um, there's a whole load of benefits that come from your labor. Um, but there's something that happens to people if they receive an income without laboring, and that is typically the result. You call that entitlement. Um, and as you know, in South Africa, just a little bit more than half of our population. So we have a population just north of 60 million. So 30 million people in South Africa currently live from welfare payments by the state. There's obviously the old age pensions, we come to that now. But for young people to receive an income um, without having to work for it, in the end creates the the concept of entitlement, also what the orphan has. The orphan that's always the victim. I mean, those spirits move together, and and ultimately it makes somebody unemployable um, because they're used to receiving without working. And that concept starts to break down the the self worth, the moral fiber of the individual. But it also means that somebody is ultimately a consumer, and that's really what that text by Paul is about. Somebody doesn't work, he shouldn't eat. So what you now get is you get a population of consumers, and the ability to create value in the country starts to decline. So you will find in South Africa at the moment, um, even though we have high levels of investment, certainly in the private sector, we have a ceiling on our growth, on our economic growth, because the level of consumption is so high. And then that links, of course, to the point that I made earlier is in I mean, God's economy is an economy of giving and receiving. And God actually wants all the people to have riches in heaven. He wants people to get saved. And it is as important, yes, we get saved when we believe in Jesus Christ, but for us becoming holy, of becoming people acceptable to God, our ability to work, to be able to give is really fundamental. Um, and we give to our families, we take care of them. We give to the aged who cannot work anymore. um, we give to the poor. We take care of widows. We take care of orphans. We bring them into our riches. And I think that's where, when communities stop doing that, in fact, they start being atomized, they start falling apart, and all the dysfunctions start to enter into the economy. And I think it's something like work is fundamental to our security. And I mean physical security and safety in a country. But let me stop there, Jan. I'm not sure whether I've answered your
Thank,
questions, but there's some more on it. Yeah.
yes, thank you, Hennie. I think also very importantly, what I want to know, I think we're looking at the kingdom economy, what a kingdom economy looks like. And I think from a kingdom economy, it begins with salvation and being saved from demons, being saved from sickness that is debilitating, that you can't work, demons, you can't work. Uh, so you become a blessing. I think that's the whole nature of the kingdom, is that the quickest you can be healed so that you can now bless the nations. You can be a blessing to people. The moment I begin to think, how can I be a blessing of people? It pertains to work. So I have to acquire a skill. I have to make something. I have to provide something. I do something in terms of art. And all of this, I begin to contribute. So I become a blessing. Someone pays money for that blessing. And eventually, I grow so that I can now also begin to give and contribute to others. My business become bigger. I need more people that can make my product and so forth, and it sort of grows. So that's sort of how I understand God's economy. At the moment in South Africa, I see that because of SASSA and because of the government not having enough funds, we just had this extraordinary thing happening, that we had a VAT increase and it had to be drawn back. And we're beginning to see there's new powers, because we are seeing we cannot continue with what you've just said. We can't continue just giving grants and just giving people money. People begin and have to earn an income. They have to contribute in terms of the value, which also speaks spiritually about them being of value and contributing from themselves of value to someone else. It actually is a social dynamic. So could you just get into that a little bit for me? That I mean, I don't, for instance, think retirement is a good thing. I think we can, beyond retirement, still contribute, still do something that we are of value of someone. And as long as I'm value of someone, people are willing to pay something for that.
Yeah, no, I mean, Jan, I fully agree with you. I think it's um, I think firstly to say that the welfare system that we have in South Africa is ultimately economically unsustainable. Um, um, we just cannot generate enough value in the country from the people that do work to actually sustain that. And I think that's part of what we currently, in fact, saw the past week happening in our country. So I think just as an almost financial fact that that is not possible. But I think to me, as a as a nation, in so many ways, we have seen when you work with people at the ground level, you find extraordinary difficulties for people to keep a job. Um, in other words, if the alternative is to get money, even if it's a little bit, as opposed to working, we have reached a situation where people become almost unemployable, um, and therefore they don't acquire new skills. It it yeah it it means that their personal disciplines wane, and ultimately they become the prisoners of lies about themselves. And I think, to me, when I look at South Africa, I see a nation to a very large extent enslaved. And that in turn leads to addictions, because people try and deal with the holes inside of themselves in the particular way, and that ultimately leads to crimes. So you have the opposite of a virtuous cycle. You have a negative cycle that's happening, and we a large part of that centers around fathers and the absence of fathers, because fathers, um, when when they become a physical father, but not a father in the sense of a family father, they ultimately become predatory on on society, because they are made to provide. So I think we see these cycles and cycles happening, which can become very destructive. So rather than focusing on that, which I think is a truth, the question is, how do we build the godly kingdom? Um, and I think that is where, if I can come back to that concept of craftsmanship, of creativity, is we go at the slavery, and we go at the poverty, by building, by being creative, by being entrepreneurs, by encouraging entrepreneurship, by funding that within our communities, by mentoring people who want to stand up. And yes, not everybody is going to make that transition. And that holds huge risk for our society, in so many ways. And I think, um, rather than speaking ill about communities that are disintegrating, we should move in forcefully to to create business, to create entrepreneurship. Doesn't matter what people say, and build that. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Hennie. We're going to ask some questions. Old friend of you, Dirkie.
Hennie, goeienaand. Good evening. I'll try in English. Um, you said the Babylonian Babylonial system is about buying and selling. I'm a citrus farmer, as you know. We are selling our fruit, so it seems to me we are in a bit of a Babylonial system. And you say the kingdom system is about giving and receiving, and it's a relational system. Can you expand on that and maybe give us a bit more clarity on that?
Yeah. No, thanks. Um, Thanks, Dirkie, and thanks for the photographs. Great to see that. You know, I I find it so interesting that that Jesus, if you go number all the texts in the New Testament, spoke a lot more about money almost than about salvation. Um, so he was very concerned with this, with money, and um, because ultimately money is a creation of man, it's not a creation of God. um, it's a system that man has developed, and and Jesus doesn't say anywhere that we are relieved from operating in the system. Um, so buying and selling is the system that we are in. Money is the system that we are in. But what he does say is that if we apply his principles, giving and receiving, um, then we we are able to overcome the bondage of that system, and we are also able to prosper. And in many cases, um, that the principle not of incremental gains, of addition and subtraction, but of multiplication will apply for us. So that the returns will be a lot bigger, even in the Babylonian system, if we apply his principles. So I think the system of trade and of buying, of selling, is not one that Jesus sought to overthrow. It's a system created by man. It's a system within which we operate. But what Jesus does provide for us is the opportunity to use kingdom principles to thrive in that system and to obtain riches. And I think one of the one of the concepts, I didn't touch on it earlier tonight, that I find particularly interesting in the financial system is its ability to trade on fear. Um, and much of that system trades on fear. The very concept of insurance, which I think all of us participate in one way or another, is built on fear. The fear of a loss, the fear of a risk. And it's very interesting that that system, the system of insurance itself, um, came, particularly life insurance, came from the Scottish revivals in the early 19th century, 1820s and 30s, which in its original concept was really about pooling risk, where people said, it is expensive for us to bury our family. Let us put a pool of money together, and from that, pay for each other's funerals. It was never intended to an extent to become the large financial system that it is today. It was intended to be relational in a very real sense, and a cooperative system as we see today. So what you would often find is that you get kingdom principles, which then in if I call the Babylonian economy, is used as a tool of enrichment and a tool of very huge capital formation. So I think what one needs is the wisdom to say, you know what, um, we are within the system, but what does God say, and how can we use His principles to thrive within the system, and to take care of one another? And a lot of that, as I say, coming back, is relational. The moment you start investing in stuff that you don't know the final destination of, and you don't really know the people who are dealing with something, you're starting to go into a higher risk category. Turkey, not I don't think I've answered all your question, but there's certainly some ideas and concepts.
I think I'm going to go over time with this tonight. Is that okay with you? Can you guys hold out a little bit more? I think this is just so important that we talk about this. Hennie, I think many South Africans on different many levels, our young people, are struggling because they find it hard to get entry into the market, into getting a related salary that at least they can buy a home and afford a car and so forth. And life has become so expensive that if you come as an entrant into the economy, you're almost not going to make it. Then we have a whole lot of farmers that, as you know, that are sort of your small, medium farmers, and so they don't have the scale. So, they are barely making it, trying to sell into a local market where there's also, all this disruptions. And I think what I want to ask is, isn't God in some way allowing this worldwide, call it wars at the moment, and contestation and so forth, so that it's forcing us again that economies become more local? And my reality is that if, for instance, food and different kinds of value can circle within their local economy for a longer period of time, we can keep that finances here. So, for instance, shopping mall with big companies that come and buy and sell here, the money that goes into those companies never come back into this economy. We are all this sort of shops, clothing shops and shoe shops that were local. At least the money that was spent there was also that was bought there in terms of people buying products. That money was also by that owner by default spent in the locality. So we see a disruption that happened over the last 30, 40 years economically, but it's almost now as if there's another disruption that is forcing us again. And I see this also with the GNU, that I think with the Government of National Unity can actually really work on local level, because on a local level we're not contesting. I mean, you can have all these different parties on a local level. Whatever they vote for, stand for, has no effect. We have to work together on the most local level and the most municipal level to get water and electricity and safety and all these sort of things. That's not political. That's just good service. So if we all have access to that and we sort of sort out our localities first, it's almost, that's where God's economy really thrives.
I think, Jan, I agree with that. I mean, to me, COVID was very, very interesting from, many perspectives. But if you go back, firstly, sort of pre-Second World War and then post-Second World War, up to, let's say, 1950s, 1960s, it, so much of capital formation, most of it happened within a nation state. It happened within the borders of a country. But as we saw the sort of emergence of globalization, which accelerated towards the end of the century, you saw that global capital formation and trading starting to happen across borders. And what tended to happen, that when it was in a country, the inequality of income, in other words, the redistribution of wealth from essentially the poor to the rich, happened within the borders of a nation state. But as globalization accelerated, that redistribution of capital started to happen across borders and started to accelerate so that people became astronomically rich. And we see that now. And what was interesting is that COVID, in many ways, started to stick um, a put a stick into this wheel as it started to disrupt supply chains, as it disrupt capital formation, and you're seeing the same thing happening now. So you're seeing somewhat of a breakdown in this globalization. So that's I think the first point to make. And it's interesting, just 2 points. If you read Thomas Piketty's book, Capital, when he looked at the accumulation of capital over 200 years and he looked at the data in particularly European countries, there were only two things that broke the cycle of more and more wealth into fewer and fewer hands. And it was war and education. Only those two things really fundamentally reshaped the redistribution of capital. Coming back now and saying at the moment, that's why this concept of, I think, the relational economy is so important. What happened in so much of agriculture in South Africa is that when we moved away from the cooperatives into companies, the shares in those companies started to get into fewer and fewer hands. And what tends to happen then is if you need to make a decision about closing a shop or buying from particular people anymore, and those people aren't in your face, it's very easy to take those decisions. That's one of the reasons why we still fight to have a cooperative in our town. It's because we take decisions on the interests of individuals because we know them, and I think that's what love is about. So I am much more likely to give a job to somebody that's down and out if I know them. I'm much more likely to invest in an entrepreneur who cannot get money from a big bank if I know they're likely to repay and they will work hard. And that's why I think you're right. It's the local is becoming the building block, is becoming the place of regeneration, and that's always what God intended. So I think that local is lekker, that focus on the locals, on the small farmers, and we have more bargaining power if you're a small farmer locally than you have with a large retailer that will simply run over you and exploit you as much as you possibly can. And I think it takes courage to do that. It takes courage to say that I get involved, because I can't just sit back. I've got to participate. I've got to make make a go at saving my school. I've got to make a go at making sure the roads are good. I've got to make a go at the security of my town. And as Anton Rupert says, I'm not going to sleep safe if my neighbor is hungry. And I think that encapsulates so much of what a godly economy is about.
Thank you, Hennie. I think, lastly, just for all of us listening and for those of you that are still tuning in, we're going a little bit over time, but we are seeing at the moment a very interesting thing, that the government is under much pressure at the moment. You see the GNU is just really holding on. We have, I think, a big victorious breakthrough in the sort of government contestation that the ANC had to give in to keep the interest rate where it was. But now my question is, there's been America. Trump has come on. He says you can come to America. We will have a whole lot of farmers coming on that direction. And because of what I said earlier, your sort of income that you now have to generate to keep 3 children in school, to get them into university, to be paying for your future and so forth. I mean, you need quite a considerable income. And what we've been seeing is that our income over the last 10, 15 years has actually either remained the same or diminished, went smaller. We see many of our small farmers, some of them are sitting here tonight, they are struggling because they don't have scale. They can't compete with the sort of bigger markets, where you have more of the bigger scale farmers who actually can have pack houses and go down into the value chain so they can create more wealth. So your sort of single producer farm are really struggling. So I want to speak to you lastly. What is your prophetic voice? Because I think, I don't know if you've seen the stats, but I think 70,000 people so said that they want to immigrate to America and take the Trump deal. But then you also see a lot of South Africans that are overseas that says they actually really want to come back. You have Rob Havsov rising up as a new political leader, not a political leader, but a voice that is really fighting and speaking into government. You see the Freedom Front Plus and other agencies that is now toured overseas, that went onto public programs and so forth. So here's my last question. As a Christian and as a church, where is God's heart? Where is God's focus? Where should we focus at the moment as believers?
Jan,
starting a whole nother hour discussion, I would guess, but
yes,
quickly.
No, it's a good question. I just want to make a statement before I answer that question, and that is a huge part of the problem that we are experiencing as small farmers, small businesses, is because we want to buy services and assets from the market, which in God's economy, the family and the community must provide. Let me give some examples. In God's economy, a community builds a house, a family builds a house for newlyweds. They don't have to go and get a mortgage to get it. In God's economy, I sent my son or my daughter to somebody else in the community to learn a trade. Yes, there are all the professional jobs that come with it. But we have within our means, without putting down cash, the enormous ability to impart skills and to create assets without people having to incur loans and without that burden having to lie on people. And I think if I would look at this, one of my greatest laments in South Africa is that our political process since 1994 have neutralized the contribution of so many people in this country that have so much to give, because of politics of shame and politics of exclusion. And we need to get over that. So prophetically, where would I focus? I think God has prepared men and women across this nation who are builders. And it's time that they stand up and say, I'm going to build where I've been planted. I'm going to build my business. I'm going to reach out to people. I'm going to contribute to my community. I do not think that there are great political solutions at the national level at the moment. I think that the value system that is necessary to build the country, I don't find evident in either of the two largest parties of the country at the moment. I find it evident in many communities. And I think that's where the building has to be. Do not be depressed by the politics. God has put an incredible amount of creativity and energy and assets and resources at the disposal of people. And they should go to him and say, what must I do to build where I am? Yeah, that's what I would say.
Let's build together there where I am. I think that's a statement, isn't it? So I think with that we're going to close, and I know we're going to have many questions even after this. I will also put the notes that Hennie gave tonight. I will give it for you guys online. But thank you so much for your time, Hennie, all the way there from Victoria West. We are thankful for technology, and I think the message tonight is the Bible actually have kingdom solutions, and we have to go back to those kingdom solutions because God's kingdom is the eternal kingdom. And as long as we are in those sort of kingdom parameters, there always will be challenges. There will always be things that shakes God's, try to shake God's kingdom. But in the kingdom of God, in what we've heard tonight, in hard work, putting our hands together. Thank you for you being listening. Thank you for being part of this talk tonight. God bless you. May the grace of the Lord Jesus be with you and Hennie and your family and everyone there we love from Victoria West. God bless you. Amen.